On 28 June 1914, the Archduke of Austria Franz Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated by a young Serbian nationalist called Gavrilo Princip. This one act triggered already brewing tensions between the six great powers: Great Britain, France, Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, into a devastating conflict that would reach almost every corner of the globe, even though it had its origins in Europe. This war would become known as the Great War because of its scale and destruction. With the advent of the Second World War, it became known as the First World War, or World War I. World War I occurred between July 1914 and November 11, 1918. By the end of the war, over 17 million people would be killed. To put that into perspective, that is roughly 1/3 of South Africa's population today. Now the question is, how is it that a relatively minor act, such as the assassination of an Archduke of a kingdom in Europe, led to one of the deadliest conflicts in history? The reasons are actually much more complicated than a simple list of causes. While there was a chain of events that directly led to the fighting, the actual root causes are much deeper. What follows is an overview of the most popular reasons that are cited as the root causes of World War I. Militarism describes when a state gives great cultural and political importance to its armed forces. War is romanticized and soldiers become national heroes. Prior to World War I, militarism was on the rise in Europe. Nations attempted to outspend each other in building up vast armies and navies. Military officials were given great influence in civilian governments. War was expected by many, and even welcomed by some. Militarism in Germany before 1914 had a long history. After Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Prussia in 1806, one of the conditions of peace was that Prussia should reduce its army to no more than 42,000 men. But the King of Prussia enrolled the permitted number of men for 1 year, trained and then dismissed that group, and enrolled another of the same size, etc. Thus, in the course of 10 years, Prussia was able to gather an army of 420,000 men who at least had 1 year military experience. The officers of the army were drawn from among the land-owning nobility. The result was that gradually a large class of professional soldiers, or an officer corps, was built up on the one hand, while a much larger class of rank-and-file soldiers were built on the other. These enlisted men became conditioned to obey all commands of the officers, creating a class-based culture of deference. This culture continued after Prussia united with other kingdoms to establish the German state in 1871. The system led to several consequences. Since the officer class also provided most officials for civil administration of the country, the interests of the army came to be considered as identical to the interests of the state. A second result was that the governing class desired to continue a system which gave them so much power over the common people, contributing to the continuing influence of the noble classes. As the world entered the 20th century, an arms race had begun. By 1914, Germany had the greatest increase in military buildup. Great Britain and Germany both greatly increased their navies in this time period. The naval arms race between Great Britain and Germany became a considerable source of tension between Germany and Britain prior to World War I. It involved the development and production of naval military hardware such as battleships by each side in an attempt to deter the one navy from attacking the other navy. In other words, both the British and Germans hoped they could gain superiority on the seas, thereby deterring the other from seeking war with them. However, the arms race was over by 1912. Moreover, despite an infamous 1908 interview with the Daily Telegraph, which implied Kaiser Wilhelm wanted war with Britain, the Kaiser came to be regarded as a guardian of peace to many in Great Britain. Meanwhile, in Germany and Russia particularly, the military establishment continued to have a greater influence on public policy. This increase in militarism helped push the countries towards war. During the 19th century, Europe experienced many changes. The French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, Industrial Revolution, exploration and colonialism. These events created tensions and rivalries between European states. Over time, countries throughout Europe, including the great powers, made mutual defense agreements that would pull them into battle. These treaties meant that if one country was attacked, allied countries were bound to defend them. For example, in 1815, the Holy Alliance between Prussia, Russia and Austria-Hungary. In 1871, Prussia, as a result of the strategic vision of Otto von Bismarck, merged with other political entities to form Germany. In 1887, Germany allied itself with Russia by means of the secret reinsurance treaty arranged by Bismarck. However, in 1890, the treaty was allowed to lapse when Bismarck was dismissed by the German king, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Russia and Austria-Hungary were locked in a dispute over the Balkans area, where the war would eventually erupt. Germany was unwilling to jeopardize the dual alliance of 1879 between Germany and Austria-Hungary. This development was attributed to Count Leo von Caprivi, the Prussian general who replaced Bismarck as Chancellor of Germany. The new Chancellor was counselled to follow a more logical approach as opposed to Bismarck's complex and even in some instances underhanded strategy. Thus, the treaty with Austria-Hungary was kept despite the Russian willingness to amend the reinsurance treaty. Von Caprivi's decision was also driven by the belief that the reinsurance treaty was no longer needed to ensure Russian neutrality in case France attacked Germany, and it would even hamper an offensive against France. Lacking a capacity for Bismarck's strategic ambiguity, the new Chancellor pursued a policy that was oriented towards getting Russia to accept Germany's promises on good faith and to encourage Russia to engage in a direct understanding with Austria-Hungary without a written accord. By 1892, the dual alliance was expanded to include Italy. In response, Russia secured in the same year the Franco-Russian alliance. This move was prompted by the Russian need for an ally since, during this period, it was experiencing a major famine and a rise in anti-government revolutionary activities. This alliance was gradually built through the years, starting from the time Bismarck refused the sale of Russian bonds in the German capital Berlin, which drove Russia to France. This began the expansion of Russian and French financial ties, which eventually helped elevate the Franco-Russian Entente to the diplomatic and military arenas. Von Caprivi's strategy appeared to work when, during the outbreak of the Bosnian crisis of 1908, it demanded that Russia step back and demobilize, which it did. After Bismarck's removal in 1890, French efforts to isolate Germany became successful. With the formation of the Triple Entente, Germany began to feel encircled. The French Foreign Minister, Théophile Decazes, went to great pains to encourage Russia and Great Britain into an alliance. There were already alliances in place, such as the Franco-Russian Alliance of 1894, the 1904 Entente Cordiale with Great Britain, and finally the Anglo-Russian Entente in 1907, which became the Triple Entente. This informal alignment with Britain and formal alliance with Russia against Germany and Austria eventually led Russia and Britain to enter World War I as France's allies. Britain abandoned its splendid isolation policy in the 1900s after it had been isolated during the South African War. It concluded agreements limited to colonial affairs with its two major colonial rivals, the Entente Cordiale with France in 1904 and the Anglo-Russian Entente of 1907. Some historians see Britain's alignment as principally a reaction to an assertive German foreign policy and the build-up of its navy from 1898, that led to the Anglo-German naval arms race. Other scholars such as Neil Ferguson argue that Britain chose France and Russia over Germany because Germany was too weak an ally to provide an effective counterbalance to the other powers, and could not provide Britain with the imperial security achieved by the Entente agreements. In the words of British diplomat Arthur Nicholson, it was far more disadvantageous to us to have an unfriendly France and Russia than an unfriendly Germany. Ferguson argues that the British government rejected German alliance overtures not because Germany began to pose a threat to Britain, but on the contrary because they realized she did not pose a threat. The impact of the Triple Entente was therefore twofold. It improved British relations with France and her ally, Russia, and demoted the importance to Britain of good relations with Germany. It was not that antagonism toward Germany caused its isolation, but rather that the new system itself channeled and intensified hostility towards the German Empire. The Triple Entente involving Britain, France and Russia is often compared to the Triple Alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy, but historians caution against the comparison. The Entente, in contrast to the Triple Alliance or the Franco-Russian Alliance, was not an alliance of mutual defense, and Britain therefore felt free to make her own foreign policy decisions. In 1914, as British Foreign Office official Eyre Crowe commented, "The fundamental fact, of course, is that the Entente is not an alliance. For purposes of ultimate emergencies, it may be found to have no substance at all. For the Entente is nothing more than a frame of mind, a view of general policy which is shared by the governments of two countries, but which may be or become so vague as to lose all content." By 1914, the following mutual defense agreements existed: Russia and France, Russia and Serbia, Germany and Austria-Hungary, Britain and France and Belgium, and Japan and Britain. Great Britain, France, Belgium, Italy, Serbia and Russia, among others, were what would become known as the Allied powers. Germany, Austria, Hungary and the Austrian Ottoman Empire were what would become known as the Central Powers. So, following the Archduke's assassination, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia got involved to defend Serbia. Germany, seeing Russia mobilizing, declared war on Russia. France was then drawn in against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Germany attacked France through Belgium, pulling Britain into war. Then Japan entered the war. Later, Italy and the United States would enter on the side of the Allies. We can see here that instead of protecting states from war, these mutual defense alliances would have a knock-on effect, increasing the scale of the conflict, from a regional feud into a global war. Imperialism is when a country increases their power and wealth by bringing additional territories under their control. Before World War I, Africa and parts of Asia were points of contention among the European countries. This was especially true because of the raw materials these areas could provide. The increasing competition and desire for greater empires led to an increase in confrontation that helped push the world into World War I. For example, imperial rivalries pushed France, Germany and Britain to compete for control of Morocco, leading to a short-lived war scare in 1911. In the end, France established a protectorate over Morocco that increased European tensions. The Agadir crisis resulted from the deployment of a substantial force of French troops into the interior of Morocco in April 1911. Germany reacted by sending a ship, the SMS Panther, to the Moroccan port of Agadir on the 1st of July 1911. The main result was deeper suspicion between London and Berlin and closer military ties between London and Paris. Increased fear and hostility drew Britain closer to France rather than Germany. British backing of France during the crisis reinforced the entente between the two countries and with Russia as well, increasing Anglo-German estrangement, deepening the divisions that would erupt in 1914. In terms of internal British jousting, the crisis was part of a 5-year struggle inside the British cabinet between radical isolationists and the Liberal Party's imperialist interventionists. The interventionists sought to use the Triple Entente to stop German expansion. The crisis in Morocco led British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey and France to make a secret naval agreement by which the Royal Navy would protect the northern coast of France from German attack, while France concentrated her fleet in the western Mediterranean and agreed to protect British interests there. France was thus able to guard her communications with her North African colonies, and Britain to concentrate more force in home waters to oppose the German high seas fleet. The cabinet was not informed of this agreement until August 1914. Meanwhile, the episode strengthened the hand of Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who was calling for a greatly increased German navy. Much of the origin of the war was based on the desire of the Slavic peoples in Bosnia and Herzegovina to no longer be part of Austria-Hungary, but instead to be part of Serbia. In this way, nationalism led directly to war. But in a more general way, the nationalism of the various countries throughout Europe contributed not only to the beginning but the extension of the war in Europe. Each country tried to prove their dominance and power. For example, some of the distant origins of World War I can be seen in the results and consequences of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to 1871 and the unification of Germany. Germany had won decisively and established a powerful empire, while France fell into chaos and military decline for years. A legacy of animosity grew between France and Germany following the German annexation of Alsace-Lorraine. The annexation caused widespread resentment in France, giving rise to the desire for revenge known as revanchism. French sentiments were based on a desire to avenge military and territorial losses and the displacement of France as the preeminent continental military power. Bismarck was wary of French desire for revenge. He achieved peace by isolating France and balancing the ambitions of Austria-Hungary and Russia in the Balkans. During his later years, he tried to placate the French by encouraging their overseas expansion. However, anti-German sentiment remained. France eventually recovered from its defeat and rebuilt its military strength again. But the French nation was smaller than Germany in terms of population and industry, and thus many French felt insecure next to a more powerful neighbor. By the 1890s, the desire for revenge over Alsace-Lorraine no longer was a major factor for the leaders of France, but it remained a force in general public opinion. Jules Cambon, the French ambassador to Berlin from 1907 to 1914, worked hard to secure a détente, but French leaders decided Berlin was trying to weaken the Triple Entente alliance between itself, Russia and Great Britain, and was not sincere in seeking peace. The French consensus was that war was inevitable. One of these factors alone probably would not have caused the war, but together they created the conditions that made war in Europe inevitable. It only needed a spark to trigger a war. That spark was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. In June 1914, a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand sent groups to assassinate the Archduke. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was heir to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. On the 28th of June, the Archduke and his wife Sophie were visiting Sarajevo, Bosnia, which was part of Austria-Hungary. Whilst driving, a Black Hand assassin attempted to kill the couple by throwing a bomb at the car they were driving in. The driver avoided the grenade, but later that day another assassin named Gavrilo Princip managed to shoot both the Archduke and his wife at point-blank range, killing them. Austria-Hungary competed with Serbia and Russia for territory and influence in the region. The assassination was in protest to Austria-Hungary having control of this region. Serbia wanted to take over Bosnia and Herzegovina. The assassination led to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia. When Russia began to mobilize due to its alliance with Serbia, Germany declared war on Russia. Thus began the expansion of the war to include all those involved in the mutual defense alliances. A brief timeline of the key events goes as follows. On 28 June 1914, the Archduke is assassinated. On 23 July 1914, Austria-Hungary issues an ultimatum to Serbia. On 28 July, exactly 1 month after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia and starts shelling the Serbian capital Belgrade. Russia, due to its alliance with Serbia, in turn declares war on Austria-Hungary and mobilizes its army on the 31st of July 1914. On the 1st of August, in response to Russian mobilization, Germany does the same. France, in response to Germany, also mobilizes its army. On the 3rd of August, Germany declares war on France. Germany seeks to invade France through Belgium, but Belgium refuses. Germany invades Belgium and then invades France. On the 4th of August, Britain declares war on Germany. At this point, the United States of America says that it will remain neutral for now. However, it would enter the war in 1917. Now, let's take a moment here to briefly look at the debate surrounding the causes of the war. Not all historians are in agreement as to the causes of the First World War. Historians looking at the long-term causes seek to explain why two rival sets of powers, the German Empire and Austria-Hungary, collectively known as the Central Powers, on the one hand, against the Russian Empire, the French Republic, and Great Britain, collectively known as the Allied Powers, came into conflict by 1914. They look at factors mentioned earlier, as well as political, territorial, and economic competition, and the power vacuum created by the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Scholars doing short-term analysis focusing on July of 1914 ask if the conflict could have been stopped or whether deeper causes made it inevitable. They argue that immediate causes lay in decisions made by statesmen and generals during this time. According to them, this crisis was caused by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It escalated as the conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia was joined by their allies Russia, Germany, France, and ultimately Belgium and Great Britain. Other factors that came into play during the diplomatic crisis leading up to the war included misperceptions of intent, like the German belief that Britain would remain neutral, as well as fatalism that war was inevitable, and the speed of the crisis, which was exacerbated by delays and misunderstandings in diplomatic communications. There remains no real consensus as to the causes of the First World War, since historians disagree on important issues such as placing emphasis on some factors over others. However, the deepest division among historians is between those who see Germany and Austria-Hungary driving events and those who focus on power dynamics among a wider group of actors. In addition, there are further differences in opinion between those who believe that Germany deliberately planned a European war, those who believe that the war was largely unplanned but still caused principally by Germany and Austria-Hungary taking risks, and those who believe that some or all of the Allied powers, Russia, France, Serbia, Great Britain, played a more significant role in causing the war than has been traditionally suggested. As mentioned earlier, the individual causes would most probably not have caused such a war, or at least not a world war, but together they swarmed to create an inevitability of war. Next time, we will look at the early battles of the First World War and how the tactics and weaponry influenced the outcome of not only those battles, but also the tone for how the rest of the war was to be fought.